Let's discuss about subzones. So we've discussed in detail about zones and subzones. So basically, zones are used for routing to different parts of the network, used for call routing. Yeah. So zones are mostly you will find the ones which are default created. You do not delete or create or modify them. But subzones are the ones which we can create. There are some default subzones also, and we can manually create some subzones also, and the purpose of creating subzones are for two purposes are there. One is bandwidth management, other is access control. Yeah, for authentication, for controlling access, all that we can do with the use of subzone. Let's suppose for default subzone also, on which all the endpoints are registered automatically by default. We want to divide that default subzone into some manually created subzones, and we want, let's suppose, some SIP endpoints on one subzone and HTTP endpoints on other subzone, just for an example. So it can be for different purposes. We can create subzones to manage bandwidth. Let's suppose we have some devices which are taking more bandwidth, so we want to put it in a subzone where we want to allow a higher bandwidth. And then we have some low bandwidth link or devices where we want to put a lesser bandwidth and create a separate subzone for that. So we can do that. So we will see here what subzones are there and how we can create. Then there are some membership rules we can configure that we will see in the lab side. So begin. All right, so this is about the subzone functionality on Expressway. So as we discussed, subzones are for bandwidth management, and access control. Zones are for routing to different parts of a network. Yeah. So this is something to know as a difference, because sometimes there is a lot of confusion between what is zones and subzones. So zones and subzones exist within Expressway, but for different purposes. Uh, Subzones are the logical groupings of the endpoints for the purpose of bandwidth management, which can provide you quality of service, bandwidth management, and access control by providing authentication. So first, the use of subzone allows the requirement that the endpoints registering to a given subzone will be required to present some credentials for authentication, while other endpoints may not be required. For example, like the ones who registered on the default subzone. But so that is the purpose we move them from the default to a subzone where we can enable authentication. Yeah. We can determine a bandwidth restriction to be applied on calls between the endpoints using these subzones. So we divide the endpoints based on the bandwidth restriction we want to allow for these. So whether they are in the same subzone or several different ones. So the calls between different subzones will take the amount of bandwidth that is applied to it. And as a default behavior, the calls between the subzones will always take a shortest logical route to the endpoint. So this is a routing behavior. So they find the shortest path, and the subzone rule will determine that which, if any, bandwidth restriction is there will be applied to it. So based on that bandwidth, it will be allocated with the amount of bandwidth. So once the logical route is decided, it has done the routing, route has been decided. If the call is blocked or if there is any restriction applied, then the call will not search any alternate route. There is no rerouting capability between subzones. So even if there is a backup path or anything, but before that, if there is any restriction which is blocking it will not be able to reroute. That is something as a routing behavior between the subzones. There is no rerouting. Then zones are for routing to different parts of the network. Different types of zones for applications within different network requirements are there. Neighbor zones are for connecting to different parts of internal network. It can be internal network because it is without the firewall. Whenever a firewall comes in, so that becomes a traversal zone and not a neighbor zone. So neighbor zones are for connecting to different parts of an internal network. It can be a CUCM or another expressway between different sites. So this zone can be within same building or a campus or maybe across a WAN as well. So then we have traversal zones, which are used for routing into or out of the network through a firewall. So that is difference between a neighbor and the traversal zones. Some common applications of this use includes like business to business calls or DNS zones, which are used for DNS role for call routing. So these are some zones, neighbor zones, we have local zone, we have default zone, we have traversal zone. Then we have subzones, which are default subzone, we have traversal subzone, and so on. Traversal subzones will be used for internally which traversal calls are used. Yeah, so that is what this is. So we can see a grouping of subzones here. Traversal subzone, this subzone one is something that is manually created. This is a default traversal subzone, which automatically gets created when you have traversal clients. For example, you have HT23 and SIP and interworking enabled, IPv4 and IPv6 and interworking enabled. If you have firewall traversal, or in case of Expressway E, it is also for dual NIC, which is used for DMZ traversal. Okay, then there are some membership rules which can be applied. So membership rules are like this, which we will see in the lab also. So we can configure membership rules based on the policies we want to create. Like here we can see some subnet mask, alias pattern, all these different types of rules we can create as per the requirement. So by default, all devices will register to the default subzone. When additional subzones are created, membership rules must be created to determine whether that device will register or not. So the expressway will look at the available rules in the order of their priority. The priority can be anywhere between um, 1, 2, 6, 5, 5, 3, 4. So when we are creating these rules, we have to apply this priority value from this range. Yeah. Then it, and the lower is preferred. So keeping that in mind. Okay, we can see some example here. Yeah, so this is how we configure membership rules. You can go to the configuration. From configuration, you can choose local zone. From there, select subzone. Once you select subzone, you can create subzone, give it a name. For example, this. Here you can see example subzone. You can create a restriction policy over there to allow or deny. And then there is an authentication policy which says do not check credentials, check credentials, and so on. You can use a drop down. You will find various different options for authentication policy. So the first rule that matched the credential of the device, which is trying to register, the expressway will register the device in the subzone that is associated with the membership rules based on the priority that you have configured. If no match is found, then the expressway will register the device to default subzone. Yeah, that is something. If there is no restriction and no match is found in the subzone that you have created, then that device will go and get registered to the default subzone based on the policies on the expressway. Then in the membership rules configuration, you can create the membership rules from the configuration. You can select create membership rule, give it a name, and you can configure a priority. Like in this example, you can see 100 is used as a priority number. Then type to match, so alias pattern match is used, and pattern type exact, pattern string is used, and target subzone is the subzone that we have just created manually, example subzone, and enable it with the state enabled. And then you have to click create rule, and the membership rule will be created. So whatever rules you are created within the subzone and the membership rules which are defined, it will take action based on that. And all the pattern strings which are matched here will get registered to this subzone.